contention surrounding Aadhaar is the issue of privacy. Aayush Ailawadi is here now to take us through the provisions in the bill that aim to address those concerns. He also has senior lawyer Rahul Matthan with him. Ayush, over to you. We just had Nandan Nilikani there saying that this is a best-in-class bill when it comes to safeguarding privacy provisions.
Absolutely, Shireen. But it's imperative to remember that this comes at a time when this case was actually being heard in the Supreme Court. We heard the Attorney General actually come out and say that Indians do not have a right to privacy. And that's something that legal experts and scholars for the longest time have always imagined, that we actually have an implicit fundamental right to privacy under Article 21. But all of that aside, there are provisions in the bill, like you mentioned, Section 28 and 29, which talk about protection of information. So that would be stuff like an individual's fingerprint, iris scan, and other biological attributes. This will not be disclosed under any circumstances. But the tricky part is really when Section 33 comes up with the exceptions. The two exceptions being in the interest of national security. And I must mention, this is when a joint secretary in the central government may issue a direction for revealing the Aadhaar number, the biometric information and the demographic information and photograph. And this decision would be reviewed by an oversight committee. And the other one is obviously on the order of a district court. I have with me partner at Trilegal, Rahul Matthan, and privacy expert. Mr. Matthan, I'd like to start by asking you, when it comes to the balance between Section 28, 29 and Section 33, do you think they've managed to strike that balance when it comes to privacy versus security?
So, I think in the first case, you need to look at 28 and 29. 28 and 29 offer some form of protection against the disclosure of your private information. 28 is just general private information. 29 goes so far as to articulate a separate category of information which is called core biometric information. And that information, as Nandan said a little earlier on, it goes so far as to say in 29 that that shall not be disclosed under any circumstances. Now, I want to pause here to reflect on the manner in which 29 has been drafted, because in my experience, I haven't seen a section drafted with as many absolutes as Section 29 has. And so if you read it standalone, it's quite a remarkable provision to curtail the government's ability to misuse this information. Now, the problem, as you've articulated, does come out in 33. And 33 offers, as you said, two exceptions. Unfortunately, the exception under 33 goes so far as to put in some question the absolute protection granted under 29 to core biometric information as well. If you look at 33, in my experience, most legislations like this would stop at saying a national security exception. The fact that this section has gone a little further and afforded one additional level of protection, which is the oversight committee. And if you look a little further, it also says that the order will only last for 3 months and will be thereafter will have to be reviewed and then only renewed. These are sort of layers of the onion that I think are unique to this legislation, and I haven't seen it in too many other legislations. This is not to say that this is absolute protection, but as Nandan also said a little earlier on, in the current times that we live in, I would struggle to find a legislation that would completely avoid that national security exception.
So, it's also interesting because this comes at a time, like I was mentioning earlier, when the Attorney General really says that Indians do not have a right to privacy. Be it the human DNA profiling bill, be it this Aadhaar bill, the key concerns have been surrounding privacy. Do you still think, and you assisted the government in the first privacy draft law, Mr. Matthan, do you think that we really still need that privacy legislation at this point in time?
Oh, absolutely. I think you need to understand that this is a legislation relating to the information collected under the Aadhaar program, which is the core biometrics that is collected under the Aadhaar program as it's articulated in the bill. This is by no means the full extent of privacy protection that we need in the country. And so I think despite the fact that we've got some reasonably robust provisions in the Aadhaar bill, we absolutely do need a full-fledged privacy legislation for the country. In fact, I would go so far as to see this Aadhaar bill in the context of a much larger privacy legislation.
One very quick question, Mr. Matthan. You also mentioned that there's a big flaw when it comes to the delegated legislations. If you could very quickly, in 20 seconds, tell us about your concerns with the delegated legislations in this Aadhaar bill, or the scope for delegated legislations.
Well, it's not just in this Aadhaar bill. I think, the government tends to get a little lazy around legislating. And quite rightly so in the context of a technology legislation. They wonder whether they've covered all the various aspects. And they leave in provisions that can be subsequently enacted through delegated legislation, through regulations. I think that this is a loophole. It is imperative that the government articulate everything that they want to in a legislation, upfront in the legislation. When you leave backdoors like through legislation, through regulation, there is an opportunity for scope creep. And that, I'm afraid, is something that hasn't been completely eliminated.
All right, thank you, Mr. Matthan, so much for joining us on CNBC TV 18. Shireen, there you have it. This is a bill which has been lauded by many experts, but there are exceptions which are still a cause for concern.
Well, hopefully those exceptions will be dealt with as well. But Aayush and Mr. Matthan, appreciate you joining us here on India Business Hour to make sense of the Aadhaar bill that's been cleared by the Lok Sabha today and explaining to us the concerns related to privacy. Now,